I must make my own meaning. I must tell my own story. I must test and approve all of the wisdom of the world. And then select the bits that chime with my personal temperament and my preferences. It sounds really nice in theory. It's terrible for us in practice. It makes us lonely and overwhelmed. There's no such thing as an individual. We are interrelated, interdependent, hypersocial creatures designed to see and be seen, to know and be known, to be so enmeshed with each other that the idea of us as an individual begins to break down.
Technology and everything is sort of just set to kind of algorithmically drive us into these echo chambers, these tribalist groups, these in and out groups. What's the bridge to help people step into community? Hello and welcome to Re-Enchanting from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Brierley.
And I'm Belle Tindall.
And this is the show where we talk to all kinds of interesting guests about how we can potentially re-enchant an arguably disenchanted secular world with the Christian vision of reality.
Indeed. And I am so incredibly excited to introduce today's guest that we're going to be doing that with. Elizabeth Oldfield is a writer, broadcaster, facilitator and coach. Through his Substack newsletter, Fully Alive, and brand new book of the very same name, Elizabeth writes about spirituality, wisdom, our common life, and the things that most deeply bind us. Plus, as a host of the Sacred podcast, Elizabeth has facilitated some of the most profound and really tender conversations of the past few years. So we're going to be speaking to Elizabeth all about her new book, her own story, and what it means to be fully alive.
Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me.
I feel like the sacred and re-enchanting are kind of kissing cousins in a way. We have a lot of overlap, I'll say that first, in terms of guests, but also the ethos somehow about having conversations that are kind of just open-ended, hopefully, and point to something bigger and transcendent. So we're going to talk all about that, obviously, but I feel like it's a bit of a collab today, almost. Sacred
a crossover.
meets re-enchanting.
You're welcome, everyone.
One of those Marvel crossovers or something, I don't know. Anyway, we normally, but not today, record on top of Lambeth Palace Library, but we're in the wonderful Palace Crypt today.
Special, isn't it?
A kind of an equally sublime place potentially to
definitely
record
my preference.
Yeah, I was very happy when I learned you would be the guest that we'd be down here with.
This is my aesthetic, icons, good. Old things.
All things old and crumbly. Yeah.
Not the chrome glass and the city behind you. Okay,
exactly.
Right, well, we normally ask, because we are normally on top of the Palace Library, what are you currently reading?
I am a bit of a flippity-gibbet, so I must have 5 or 6 books on the go. And one of them is the new Martin Luther King biography by Jonathan. His surname is spelled E-I-G, and I have no idea how you say that. It's called King, and it is amazing. Moving, challenging, upsetting, brilliant. Yeah. I'm always really reading a Dorothy L. Sayers mystery novel.
Nice.
Just cycle through them.
Yeah.
I'm reading the new Beth O'Leary rom-com. I am reading a lot of kind of books about peace building and reconciliation and how do we encounter each other as fully human, and the New Yorker and whatever else is lying around.
Wow, that's a lot of books. Are you a really bookish person in general?
Yeah, I begin to get anxious if there's not reading material within my arm span.
Yeah.
We spoke to Jessica Oyolowo on the last edition of the podcast, and obviously has done an amazing documentary just recently on Martin Luther King, and just
and
so much,
and Selma.
Yeah, but great to have you with us. Thank you.
Yeah. We're going to chat about so much, and I would say the book nerd in me just wants to get straight to the book, but lay in context. Can you tell us a little bit of your story? And in the book, you call yourself, and this is one of my favourite phrases ever, a contentedly failed atheist. And I was just wondering, could you tell us the story of how you've got to that place?
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like I've been everywhere. I was raised in a family that was probably kind of lightly culturally Christian in that way that was a bit more standard in the 80s. But my mum had sort of no religious belief, no religious background. Her family were sort of very dismissive of that kind of thing. And my dad sort of privately, quietly, I think, had a faith, but it was, there was no conversation. It was not on the table. It was not something that was very present in our lives. There was a few kind of trips to the local Methodist church, Sunday school, but I think it was for free childcare. My parents would then go home, mummy and daddy time. And I sort of drifted away, and it wasn't a thing, wasn't part of my life. And then I got invited to Soul Survivor, which is a big kind of Christian youth festival by some friends, by a friend who took me to her youth group, and then her youth group took me to Soul Survivor. And I was the very skeptical, nerdy, I remember asking all the apologetics questions at youth group. I wouldn't have known that that's what they were called. But I was like, what about suffering? What about other religions? What about homosexuality? And the youth group leaders were lovely, but that wasn't particularly their thing. They weren't that way inclined. And so they were so kind, because they were like, let me get back to you on that. They'd go and like ask the vicar for some recommendations for some books, and then do some reading and then come back. So by the time I got to the festival, I was had been drawn into a community, but still had no particular sense that there was anything there for me. And then eventually I decided that I would test it, and I prayed in the middle of one of those big meetings that had seemed to me to be full of like very strange people speaking very strange languages, unnecessarily hyping things up. And I prayed, God, if you're there, show me. And I had this very profound... It's funny. I've told this story so many times, and I begin to be skeptical of my own memories. The stories we tell a lot, right? You're like, what is actual memory, and what is...
Yeah. Like, how have I polished it up?
Exactly, yeah. Like, I'm very skeptical of myself, but I can't think of that moment without some sort of echo of the... Sorry,
Fine.
That doesn't always happen. Encounter.
Yeah.
And that was that, really.
Yeah.
But I never really found a way to combine that like nerdy questioning bit of me with that emotional experiential encounter that I'd had. And so just under a decade later, I was working on a program about the Bible for the BBC and started asking all those questions again at a deeper level, and it all fell apart. And I had, a really hard chapter of thinking I'd built my whole life on a bunch of nonsense.
So I guess my next question is...
I'm still there. No.
Was that the end of the story?
Yeah.
How did then you manage to put those questions together with that obviously very deep experience that obviously even today still brings back, significant echoes? Yeah. So it's a funny thing in my story, because both of my the major chapters, I have a friend who calls this your spiritual autobiography. Like the major beats in my spiritual autobiography happened at Soul Survivor, and then on an apologetics training weekend with the Zacharias Trust. And I can tell what's coming next.
Yeah, that those organisations, which I received a lot of blessing and goodness and life, also had leadership that was deeply compromised, right? And a big part of my faith story, I think, is coming to be able to hold more complexity and hold some of those tensions. But yeah, I basically, my friend Meg, she probably wouldn't say this, but I basically got conned into going on an apologetics weekend by a friend.
It happens to the best of us, yeah.
She knew, she was like, look, I know you're not into all this church stuff at the moment, but someone's dropped out and it's a hotel and it'll be really nice and it's all paid for. Like, just come and hang out with us, like friends from the church that I had been in before.
Would she do the whole, you don't even need to come to the main session
Yeah.
You can just read in a corner.
Just have some downtime, et cetera. And so I showed up and there was, Emil Ewing and Michael Ramsden doing their things. And I went into those sessions so angry and I poured out all of my questions and all of my confusion and all of my this is a hypocritical bunch of nonsense. I'm being very polite. And we're just met with a lot of honestly, it was that one of those real humbling moments of oh, I thought I was the smart one who'd noticed the...
I thought I was telling you everything that's wrong.
Oh, wait, you've... What? Oh, you might have spoiled some of this stuff too. Well, okay. And so that was the beginning of I think there is an intellectually rigorous strand of this tradition that I can walk, that's not requiring certainty, is less black and white, is welcoming, doesn't need me to check my intelligence at the door. Right. So, long and winding road from there, but I've never again been in that place of maybe there's nothing in this.
Yeah. And like we were saying a little bit earlier off camera, like in those intellectual places, they're not deemed unsuccessful if you don't come to this one neat conclusion. You can just sit in them and you can tussle in them and wrestle in them and like ruminate and all of these things.
Yeah.
I love that very much. If I could sum up what the kind of conversations we have here on Re-Enchanting in one sentence, I think I found that sentence in the introduction to your book, Fully Alive. So you say, today's plural, secular, Western societies have gifted us many things. And I love the generous curiosity in that, because they absolutely have. But then you go on to say, but reliable sources of communal meaning isn't one of them. I was just wondering if you could break that open for us. And in particular, I'm like, what really stood out for me in that quote was the word like reliable and communal.
Yeah.
And that those two things are, if meaning doesn't have those two things, is it true meaning? So could you just break open what you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll probably start with communal because that's everything for me. That's the ball game.
Yeah.
And I think, not to get too abstract, but so much starts with what you think a human being is. Our anthropology, our deep assumptions about who we are as human beings and what we need in the world can set us up for a set of answers that flow in a lot of different directions. And post-Enlightenment and Protestantism is all caught up in this too. The sort of unspoken anthropology of our society is that we're individuals. We are fundamentally existentially isolated, that we are rational, self-optimizing actors in the world. And we can get into these nice relationships with people if it's working for everyone, right? These kind of contractual or, it's not that we can't be in relationships, but those relationships are not fundamental to who we are. Who we are is our journey, our path, our story. And our attempts to make meaning, if that's our anthropology, flow from that, right? I must make my own meaning. I must tell my own story. I must test and approve all of the wisdom of the world.
Yeah.
And then select the bits that chime with my personal temperament and my preferences, because we are formed into consumers. And that sounds really nice in theory. And I just think it's terrible for us in practice. It makes us lonely and overwhelmed. And so the fundamental sort of assumption that runs through the book and in everything that I try and do in my life is there's no such thing as an individual. We are interrelated, interdependent. The sociological term is hypersocial creatures. The theological term is made in the image of a Trinitarian God, designed to see and be seen, to know and be known, to be so enmeshed with each other that the idea of us as an individual begins to break down. And so when you lose traditions, when you lose wisdom paths, when you lose intergenerational transfer of knowledge, what you get is a lot of lonely, overwhelmed people trying to make a world of meaning for themselves when they were never meant to. And so more and more, I am very suspicious of anything that's like, this is about me and my path. This is about me and my growth. This is about me and my destiny. This is about me and my dreams. It's a lie. It's a trap. It sounds nice and it's not.
So much of the self-help stuff is essentially about the focus is on the individual and about how do you achieve your life goals and how do you, get to your level of physical fitness. And very rarely does it ever kind of suggest joining something bigger than you, where you would maybe have to sacrifice, something of your own preferences.
Yeah, or that even the fundamental conception of flourishing is collective.
Yeah.
That there actually isn't such a thing of one person flourishing on their own in a network of relationships that aren't working, right? That the possibility of disentanglement from each other is a lie. But it drives us further apart. And so we remain entangled, but in tension, in fractured, dislocated, tense, high balance required relationships. Sure. So that's kind of what I mean by communal. I am less and less interested in a thing that is going to repeatedly form me into individualism. And the reliable one is really about longevity. It's about, ideas, practices, communities that have stood the test of time in different cultural contexts, in different settings, in different nations. And that is not to say that I don't think anything new is of worth. I think some things that are new are not a trend and will endure and will become, reliable long-term collective sources of meaning. I think, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is the sort of increased understanding of neurodiversity. And there are ways where that can be misused and can be, get a bit out of control. But at the heart of it, I think something is coming into the world there that helps us understand each other with more compassion and more grace and more generosity and more hospitality. I don't want to write off the new, but the ideas that I want to build my life around, and there's not much capacity and not much attention and not much RAM, so I need to choose carefully, are the ones that I've stood this test of time, that other people have found transformative because I'm less and less faith in my own ability to judge, frankly.
You in the book, you use a way of opening up this whole space and how we can be fully alive in a world that so often seems geared against doing that in the ways that we've sort of previously done. You use the category of the deadly sins, sin, which in itself is quite an archaic to most people term. So why that? Where obviously some people feel almost allergic to that term. How would you even explain a word like sin to someone who perhaps has those associations? Yeah,
well, I'm always slightly nervous about talking about this because I'm aware there's so much kind of theological scholarship around what sin is. So I need to sort of preface this with this is my way of thinking about it. And I think of sin as fracture. I think it as disconnection and dislocation. And it's because of my definition of fully aliveness, right? And because it flows from my anthropology, that the fully aliveness, life in its fullness is relationship, is connection. It is restoration and wholeness with ourselves, because I do think most of us realize there's like a lot going on in here, right? And the different wisdom traditions have all talked about this, whether you talk about the flesh and the spirit, whether you talk about the id and the ego and the superego, again and again, anyone reflecting on how human beings work end up with, there seems to be different parts of ourselves and they're not always fully aligned. But yeah, disconnection with ourselves, disconnection with the bit of me that actually is the deep, old, wise knowledge of what love looks like and what I need and what helps me flourish. I sin against that part of myself when I try and distract it or numb it or beat up on it, right? Disconnection with each other, fracture, either through attack or withdrawing, either through competition, either through deep and endemic failure to love our neighbours as ourselves, frankly, in all these different diverse ways. I'm coming to an understanding of disconnection from the earth and the world and creation, that we can sin against that. And ultimately, of course, disconnection with divine love, with the relationship I believe that we're made for and that holds us. But I'm very careful in the book not to start there, because I think it might help people understand that bit if you invite them into a journey of seeing this fracture and disconnection everywhere else.
I mean, I very much get the sense that you want someone who does not necessarily think of themselves as religious to be able to sort of see that this concept of sin might just still apply to them.
Yeah.
And of course, you borrow a phrase from Francis Spufford, the human propensity to F things up, which I think was, again, a former guest on the show, a brilliant way of just kind of breaking down a barrier in that way. And I feel like your book does that actually in all kinds of other ways too.
Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you for it. I mean, talk about maybe some of the specific ways in which you get into these different sins then and how you kind of relate them to this whole idea of reconnection. I guess another word for that would be shalom, with each other, the world, God.
Yeah. So it was a very challenging process. I think
you didn't pick an easy job for yourself, did you?
No. I knew I wanted to write a book that was a way of translating the treasures of this tradition into the conversations that my friends are having, most of whom would frankly look everywhere else but the church. They are, a lot of them are taking psychedelics. A lot of them are very interested in stoicism. A lot of them are doing a lot of yoga and meditation, right? There is, there are all these, and a lot of them are brilliant sources of wisdom where they're going looking. Yeah. But Christianity is like this box that they just won't go anywhere near. It's just assume there's nothing in there for them. And I kind of want to go, could we just, there are 2,000 years of quite thoughtful reflection on the human condition here. Like, even if you
peek in it.
even if you can't get on board with the sort of metaphysical frame, let's just maybe not write off the whole thing. And so trying to translate those treasures into the context. There were a lot of themes that were coming up, and I didn't want to write about sin. Even though I know Francis Buffer's book and it's amazing, and that human propensity to F things that really changed how I think about it. I was like, nah, that's too much. It's too much for everyone. Like, start with this. Go with the low-hanging fruit. Start with the easy bit. But the more time I spent with these themes, the more I was like, this is invaluable. If we don't have a way of thinking about our brokenness and not just our brokenness, our breaking thingsness, right? Yeah. The tendency in us to break things. How do we move forward? How do we actually reconnect and restore and reconcile ourselves with each other and the world, and ultimately with the divine? And so the 7 Deadly Sins felt like a really helpful framework, because people sort of get that in a slightly ridiculous way. That's a funny concept often, right? There's a Magnum range.
That's exactly what I think of. I think of an ice cream chocolate bar when you say 7 Deadly Sins.
Yeah. It's like a silly trope. There's a bunch of horror films about the 7 Deadly Sins, right? It's not a hefty theological concept that most people feel like they need to know the patristics to understand. But my goodness, did it school me? Did it school my soul? Because when you sit with, so for example, the 7 Deadly Sin of envy, I realized what for me is underneath that status anxiety is a lack of a stable sense of self, which feels to me completely endemic. It probably always has been, but we have carefully set up a world to make it worse for ourselves.
Turn the dial up to 11.
And again, I was like, wow, we have these tendencies, and we've created a society that is deliberately and intentionally and repeatedly reinforcing them in us. Yeah. What is that? So when I talk about avarice, which is the sort of greed that's distinct from gluttony, that became about consumerism and materialism and the climate crisis and my insatiable lust for stuff. And the acedia, which is this wonderful word, which a bit like shalom doesn't translate directly to peace. Acedia doesn't translate directly to sloth. It's much more distraction, listlessness, spiritual apathy, and a failure to give our attention to the things that really matter. I don't know if any of you have a problem with that. I have a problem with that. I have to put my phone in a different room, lock the door, change the code. I'm ridiculous. And so being able to see these things in society that we all struggle with, right? How do we resist individual and be in community in the chapter on pride? How do we find a way to be at peace with our sexuality and not dehumanize other people, not instrumentalize other people, not bring dynamics of power and oppression into our sexual lives? Again and again, sort of, I was astonished at the riches in my tradition and how thinking of these things within this frame schooled me.
One of the most terrifying afternoons of my life, I had to go into so my friend is an English teacher, and I had to go into a secondary school, and she asked me to come in because my background is kind of biblical studies. And she was teaching here year 10 and 11. So if I'm right, that's about 14, 15-year-olds. Paradise Lost, Milton's Paradise Lost. And so she was like, we can't get our heads around the theology of this. Can you come in and talk about it? And I went in with fear and trembling. It was terrifying because it's all about sin. And I was like, how am I supposed to go in and tell these teenagers that I believe they're all sinners? Like, what? This is going to be awful. I went in and I started speaking about it, and sort of what you said resonated, where they were kind of like, it felt quite, well, they were like, oh, there's a brokenness to humanity. There's a break. I love that. I'm going to use that all the time. There's a breaking thingsness to me. And that's in everyone. And I remember we chatted to Marilyn Robinson about this all the way in season 1. And she was like the generosity, actually, of like, what we kind of would read in Genesis of the fall. But just this general, there's a brokenness in all of us, a fracture in all of us that's deep, that's in our soul, that's bigger than us and in all of us. Actually, there's a real generosity in looking that in the eye. And I think that's what your book does so beautifully. I read the chapter on envy and I was like, this feels like I'm awake for my own heart surgery. Like, I don't. Wow. It's great, but it's uncomfortable and it's wonderful. Writing it with we are a piece of every of the chapters you write about, but was there one where you were like, this is particularly eye-opening? This feels like being awake for my own heart surgery a little bit.
Yeah, avarice.
Ah, yeah.
I think Christians in general close one eye when we read our traditions call to what a life-giving relationship with money looks like. I was just like, oh my goodness, I am such a hypocrite. The complicity in systems, the way, and I think a lot about climate change and the climate crisis and how have we got here? And we've got here because the love of money is the root of all evil, right? We want more comfort and convenience insatiably, and we are not prepared to compromise on our comfort and convenience, even when other people are dying, right? Like, there's this St. Basil sermon from the 4th century, that's like, if you have the money in your savings account was for the poor, they are hungry because it's in your ISA.
Yeah, wow.
Like,
yeah.
The 4 pairs of shoes in your wardrobe were meant for the homeless person on your high street who does not have any shoes. I have given you enough. Why are you hoarding it? Man, the challenge of how radical scripture is hit home extremely hard. And I still don't know what to do with it. Whenever I have to reread that chapter, I'm like, oh Lord, I'm not even inching towards softening my heart sufficiently to hear that challenge. I'm like millimetering myself, but trying to stay open to that level of awareness of our own complicity and hypocrisy and compromise around money and possessions and consumerism and materialism. That was the one. Sorry.
Yeah,
no one wants to hear it.
No, it's
Everyone has to though.
it's the one. Yeah, it's the passage in the gospel when he tells the rich young man to go away and sell everything he has, that everyone sort of puts all kinds of caveats on.
Yeah. Well, it was just for him.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it is, and it's challenging. But I don't know. I feel like we need a challenge at the moment.
Yeah.
And that's certainly what these.
Is that it? And again, when I was writing this, the phrase I used was something like, I came to see this bit of my tradition not as like finger wagging moralizing, but like necessary unpleasant medicine. Like, take the medicine.
Yeah.
It is good for us. Like the just wanting to be like, yes, get this into my veins. I am like moving in a world of lies and I have become a liar. How do I align myself with this level of truth and justice? And that's again, I was like, our culture needs to hear this. I need to hear this. Like, this is the place where it is clearest. Why are we ignoring it?
I am just popping in to invite you to be a part of our Seen and Unseen community. You can have Seen and Unseen sent straight to your inbox. On Tuesdays, our editors give a weekly roundup of things that have caught their eye in culture, current affairs, trends, all of it. On Fridays, you will have the best of Seen and Unseen articles delivered directly to your inbox. And you will also be first to know about any events that we have coming up. So head to seenandunseen.com to subscribe.
One of the key characters in the book is actually a community, and you've spoken already about the aspect of communal that we're lacking in our culture today. So tell us about this intentional community that you're part of, where that came from, and what goes on.
Yeah. I always feel like I need to caveat it with it's very small. Sometimes I talk about it as a micro monastery. So we felt very inspired by the kind of monastic traditions down the centuries. But, my husband and I were married by this time. We had kids. It's like neither of us is going to become a monk or a nun. And personality-wise, that would be quite a challenge anay.
Too extroverted.
Yeah, too extroverted, too gobby. Yeah. Not always brilliant with authority. But just a sense, I think particularly we were in our late 20s, early 30s, and there was this sense of a fork in the road. Like, a lot of us had spent our 20s wanting to live kind of adventurous, radical lives, like wanting to work out how these values could look in the world. And there is a very strong pattern where the middle decade, your 30s and 40s, where whatever path you've taken, you probably got much more responsibility than you used to have. You've got more financial ties. You might have more caring responsibilities. The ability to hold the Substack I write about staying loyal to our values, like the ability to live the kind of life your heart is calling you to, and actually do it, rather than just be like, well, I just felt this like the tides, the pull to just like buy a bigger house, get a nicer kitchen island, slowly upgrade my wardrobe, spend more money on skincare. I'm working on that one. Like make myself look great on LinkedIn, go on the keto diet, like the actual things that take up most of my time and attention are forming me away from the life I wanted to live, right? This radical call to a life of God and neighbor, to a love of God and neighbor. And so I think we were just like, how do we stop this? What can we actually put in structurally to form us in a different direction? And it felt like living up close with other people, being forced to share, being forced to be seen, would be both good for our own souls and our own discipleship, but also be a place that other people could come into and see a different logic, see a different way of living. And so we went on a very long and winding road, which I unpack a bit in the book, but it has basically ended up with us living with one other family in a house in Peckham with 2 guest rooms where people come and stay, sometimes short term, sometimes a bit longer term, and kind of come into the rhythms of community. We're looking to try and expand a little bit so that we have space for people who are refugees or people who are in more kind of acute crisis. We have a chapel in the garage. It does not look anything like this one.
You do.
With concrete walls and a tin roof. And we have a rule of life, which is this old phrase from kind of monastic thinking, which is basically, how do you structure your time to keep those values that you're trying to stay loyal to up front and center? How do you take charge of your formation and the way you're spending your attention? And so we have rhythms of prayer, collective prayer. We did morning prayer this morning. We do Compline together. We spend time together as a community, investing in our relationships. We spend time trying to serve the community. We spend time on fun, celebration, real central value. And we've covenanted our life together with people that we're neither related to nor married to at a really close level.
I mean, I really valued a very generous review you gave of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But that was when I encountered you talking about this community, because one of the things you quite rightly critiqued in my book was that I'd spend quite a bit of time talking about some fairly conservative, mainly male characters who are sort of interested in sort of the transcendent and the religious, and whether there's, a kind of rebirth of some kind of spiritual awareness. But one of the things you said very helpfully is, well, I'm in this sort of small intentional community and I'm seeing quite a lot of other types of people who are also interested in this whole thing. So tell us a bit about that, because I think that was a really helpful learning point for me, that actually often these people aren't necessarily people who have the big stages, but there's something going on for everyone, whatever their demographic is, when it comes to this search for something more.
Yeah, I think and I am very, you and I are very much on the same page, that I am seeing a huge uptick in spiritual openness. It's easy for Christians to be most comfortable with and find easiest to find stories of people who sit on the kind of right on centre right and have come really because of a sense of alignment with values, or Ian Hersey Ali might be one of those. One, I think all those individual stories are more complex. And 2, I think I am seeing an equal level of spiritual openness opening up in different tribes. And so environmentalism, for example, there is a large number of people who have given their life to trying to halt or slow down the climate crisis and are now often in despair, right? And what they're coming up against is the broken, the breaking thingsness of us.
Yeah.
I think of a Paul Kingsnorth in that sort of
background in environmental movement. There are people, and this Martin Shaw would sit in this box a bit more, who have been in the more animist, kind of nature oriented spirituality, ritual and practice, sort of overlaps on one end with a kind of new age spirituality. And I'm always nervous of the language, because I don't want to kind of self-describe for people who will be like, that's not how I think of myself. But those kind of moving groups of people who are seeking wisdom, who are seeking meaning, who are often deeply morally profound. There's a lot going on there. And it's causing some challenges, right? Paul Kingsnorth, Martin Shaw, other people in that network, a lot of people feel a bit betrayed, right? That because their association with Christianity is of people who hate them. And that is toxic, that their associations are something that not as someone who comes to love their neighbor, but someone who will hate them and judge them. That is not a welcome posture. And I'm doing an event in a few weeks online with a friend, because I think there is a huge thing happening with people who are taking psychedelics and moving from a very closed atheist materialist worldview into something much more spiritually open. And that's taking people in all different directions. And I have all kinds of questions about what it means and what's healthy and what's unhealthy and how the church should respond. I do not have a clear policy on this yet. But what I can say is many of the people who want to come and talk about Jesus are in the aftermath of using psychedelics. And I just want to know how to be of use to them.
Obviously, this podcast is called Re-Enchanting, which is kind of a response to the age of disenchantment, demagification. If I asked you, are we in that age? I'm assuming you'd say a big fat no.
Did you say demagification?
Yeah, that's the...
Fascinating word.
Yeah, well, I can't claim it. That's the more literal translation of Max Weber's Disenchantment.
What a lovely...
There you
what
go.
a lovely nerd fact.
Yeah, you've given me our breaking thingsness. Take that.
Demagification.
Demagification, yeah.
No, I don't think so anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it ever was. I think there is probably an argument that sort of middle of the 20th century modernism could have been seen as that, in the kind of the way the world of ideas was at least attempting to narrate us to ourselves. Yeah, my guess is since the turn of the millennium, you've had huge uptick in interest in magic, enchantment, that you just have to look at, this is the former director of Theos, you just have to look at the stats around tarot cards and astrology to see that feeling part of a bigger spiritual story is something that many, many people are very hungry for.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't not speak about the sacred.
Great.
Such a wonderful resource, and so many times, I don't know if I should admit this, but I'll see who your guests are, and I think
it's not just you. Don't worry, Mel.
Oh,
I know what you're going to say.
I see who your guests are, and I think I'm not gonna. Yeah. I'm definitely not going to enjoy it. No, I'll enjoy it, but I'll enjoy disagreeing with every single thing they say in that episode. And then what happens, Elizabeth? And I don't know how you do this. Is that never happens? You seem to create this. Well, like we said it in the bio, I don't think I've ever listened to an episode of The Sacred where I haven't seen at least one of the most tender versions of the guests that you get on.
Yeah.
And I mean, as a podcaster, I'm like, how did you do this? As a listener, I'm like, this is incredible. And I think so much of what you do speaks into and just really calls out and says, we don't have time for tribalism, polarization, division in this space. And so just looking at the wider world, because this year looks like it's probably going to be a big old hotbed of all of those things. What central things have been pulled out that have made space for those things to just flourish, for tribalism to flourish and division to flourish? And I say this as someone who, as that embarrassing story attests, I'm like, tell me how to get out of this cycle of
You
tribalism.
say this as someone who is a human.
Yeah, maybe.
The reason I do the reflections at the end of the podcast is to normalize it, to go, I didn't want to talk to this person. They were pressing all these buttons. And as it turns out, everyone is more complex and beautiful and interesting and fragile than we allow ourselves to believe. Yeah. Because caring for people is really exhausting, right? It's much nicer to be able to think there's good guys and bad guys and that we're the righteous ones. And I just honestly, the wrath chapter. So in the book, I talk about wrath as really about this tendency in ourselves. The sociologists call it homophily, and a very helpful guy called John Yates calls it people like me. That one of our tendencies we need to resist is our overarching preference for people like me. And the way I have learned to do that is through the ministry of Jesus. And I think that's one of the things. I'm always very, and I think Tom Holland is also more nuanced on this. Like, I'm always very nervous of going, look, 2,000 years of Christian influence has been brilliant and now we've lost it and everything's gone wrong. Like the story of the way Christian and scriptural ideas have interacted with culture and where they have been life-giving and liberating and where they have not been those things is really complex, right? So we need to be careful about overclaiming. So we are humans and terrible messengers. But I think I would say that the foundational anthropology that we see in the New Testament, that like, to speak very starkly, I think you can make a very strong argument that polarization, tribalism, groupishness are sin, and one of the primary sins that I see in Scripture. You see Jesus being someone who repeatedly, mischievously, relentlessly crosses divides. Tom Wright is great on this. He'll be like, who is going to drive everyone mad if I go sit with them? Purity codes, in and out groups, who will be seen with who? He's just like, turn it all upside down, create chaos.
Yeah.
About him. It's just like, walk away. Just not letting people get away with, but of course not them. I won't be seen with them. The gospel isn't for them. I'm not called, they're not my neighbor. I'm not called to love them. That's just like, it's so deep in us, the temptation. And the Scripture again is like, it's bracing medicine for that. And then there's some very, very concrete things that he says, which is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I could spend my whole life, if it was just that, if that was the one command of my tradition, I could spend my whole life trying to live that and still not get there.
Yeah.
And we at least had a culture that in theory knew that we were supposed to love our enemies and we were supposed to not rule anyone out based on their position or their group or their past or if they hated us, right? We don't get to hate them back if they hate us. That's not part of this walk. That's not part of this path. What we have now, I think, is the inverse of that, which is righteousness is attack. Righteousness is policing. Righteousness is being the pure ones against those unrighteous others who we will cast from the tent. And I see this as clearly on the right as on the left. I see this everywhere. But that actual horrible, like two-headed mutant thing that's happened with morality, which is to be a good person, you must exclude people. You must stay pure and resist the company of people not like you. It's just a completely demonic lie. And that's why I need that medicine.
Yeah. And whether it's got a religious sheen or not, sadly, that is almost the way, as you said earlier, our current technology and everything is sort of just set to kind of algorithmically drive us into these echo chambers, these tribalist groups, these in and out groups, and so on. So it's even harder now to actually live what Jesus said about loving your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and so on. So how do you do it? How do you cultivate that kind of generous curiosity? Simple question.
How do you do it?
But,
I'm just saying we should. I don't know how. No.
But it's like having to relearn something or kind of step out of a whole world that basically trains you to do the opposite.
Yeah. So the sort of overarching theme of my book that I'm not sure I ever say out loud because it's like quite a technical theological concept is formation. And so I think of all these practices as counter formation to a world that we have not consented to be formed by, but we are formed by. And so the sacred, when I started it, as it turns out, is a counterformative practices for me and some listeners. The amount of people that we get saying, I thought this person was a monster. As it turns out, I agree with them on this, and this. They're a human being. I can see how they got to where they are. Still don't necessarily agree with them, but my heart has softened sufficiently that it is much harder for me now to dehumanize them. And that's the poison. Yeah. So we can draw the poison of dehumanization out of it, then we can disagree in ways that don't break us at that deep level. Yeah. And so the practices that I talk about are be someone who crosses tribes, be someone who deliberately and explicitly and repeatedly, even if your friends raise an eyebrow at you, are seen with people that you should not be seen with. Listen to people that you should not listen to, both in your media environment and in your home environment and in your world. Pray, actually and literally pray for your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. There is nothing that more quickly drains the contempt out of me than forcing me to pray for someone. Very often I'll be like watching the news or I'll be trying to deal with someone in church. And I'm like, here's all the reasons I'm right and they're wrong. How do we fight this? And I hear that voice now because I've spent so much time in it. Pray for them, pray for them, pray for them, pray for them. And it takes maybe 30 seconds. And my threat reaction goes down. There's this hormonal and neurological pathways related to all this, right? And then you didn't need to unpack that in the first century when Jesus said it. But we now know what happens when you pray for someone. Your threat reaction goes down, your adrenaline goes down, your cortisol goes down. The bit of your brain that is able to be empathetic and curious and open gets back under control. And you can be in relationship with each other. You can turn the other cheek, right? That literally means resist your fight or flight impulse. Don't fight back and don't run away. Stay. Steady yourself and stay. Like stay. Keep eye contact. Keep a conversation going. Refuse to dehumanize your opponent or completely withdraw from them. And that skill of like confident non-defensiveness, and you see it in the civil rights movement, you see it in Martin Luther King, right? He didn't fight back, neither did he run away, right? Just stay steady, open, clear, honest, human, assuming the other person has enough humanity to hear your case, even when you have no evidence that that's the case, because that statement of faith, you are a human being, or you are made in the image of God, or you are part of a beloved community. You are my neighbor, even if you hate me. It's radical rewiring and disrupting of the dynamics that hurt us. It's just like every time I go back to it, I'm like, that's just brilliant, brilliant, tactically and strategically brilliant. Turns out Jesus had some things to say.
Yeah, because there's kind of like a dualism to that, because in one way that's incredibly hard because of it means it requires unlearning almost everything. Yeah. But in another way, when we do manage to do that, it's actually weirdly quite restful, because you think, this is what we were made for. Actually, this sits better in my soul.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. Yeah. I have all these random friends from tribes that, unless I'd been pretty intentional, we never, ever, ever would have ended up friends.
Yeah.
And they're brilliant and fascinating and funny and cool and kind. And they have enriched my life immeasurably. And I've learned so much. I mean, I've had to let go of a bunch of certainties. I've had to let go of I'm right and you're wrong. I've had to let go of so much in order to be someone who can, but if you have any desire for adventure in your life, any desire to like have thoughts you haven't had before, or have your preconceptions challenged. Like the trouble is that self-righteousness, we have these functions where if we assume something and it's confirmed, we get a little cognitive reward, right? We really like being right. That is one of
dopamine hits.
Exactly. Yes. That is one of the things that play in us. That is that is formation, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think our tradition calls us into mystery. It calls us into challenge of that. But there's another reward system, which is when we assume something and we're surprised. If we're calm enough and steady enough, that also feels great. Just like, I didn't know that. I didn't expect you to say that. And I am like, okay, how do I set up my life where I'm trying to move towards that?
Yeah.
Not the one that, because then my world narrows. If I have every assumption confirmed,
yes,
I end up in a tiny, lonely little island.
Yes.
Are there any particular conversations that stand out for you on that front? I mean, we've certainly had some conversations that kind of wedge themselves in our memory and consciousness here. So I don't know, it's like probably asking you to choose between your children, but what are some of the conversations that have kind of had that aha moment?
Loads. Almost every conversation I have like, oh, that's not the answer I would have guessed you would give to that. Yeah. Like just most recently, I had a conversation with Freddie Sayers, who's the CEO of Unheard. And we were talking about lockdowns. And even as soon as I say that, listeners will be like, because it's one of those very deep divisive things, right? And I don't know where I'd land now, but at the time I was, pretty cautious and wanting to be someone. I come from a medical family. We were living in community. We had kids. We had people in our world who were immunosuppressed, right? The story that I told about people who were flouting lockdowns at the time was not super generous or human or godly, frankly. And Freddie was on the different side of that. And he was really skeptical about whether lockdowns were necessary or helpful or actually going to protect anyone. And the reason he gave for it was because we are interdependent, interrelated people, and we need each other, and we are hypersocial. And when we remove ourselves from each other, then we start to fear each other, and then we cannot connect with each other. And I was like, oh no.
He's speaking your language. What do you do with that?
He's come round the back and just sort of...
That is aligning with all my values.
Damn it.
It's possible you came to a different conclusion from me based on the same values, and you're not a monster and I'm not a monster, and we were all just navigating uncertainty to the best of our ability.
And we were all scared.
We were all scared, exactly. And so this like tendency to want more certainty than to want to be God, right? To be able to see everything and understand everything and know every issue and come to the correct conclusion on everything, and to be able to finger point that everyone else is wrong. It's sin. It's a temptation that we need to resist, and I'm trying to do that.
That's really helpful. I mean, like us, you have a signature question on the sacred. What is sacred to you?
Which is a bit deeper than our signature
It is,
question.
to be fair.
I think
Yours?
Well, the one we
books
asked
one.
you, the books.
I don't
What are
think
you
that's not
reading? So that's what we always start off with.
Yeah.
But we love your question. And I'm sure you've been asked it yourself, but we're going to ask it as well. What for you is sacred?
Yeah, it won't be a surprise. It's relationship, relationality, community, connection. It's a sense in which fullness of life is in is in love, for want of a less overused word. And that when we love and are loved by the divine and love and are loved by our neighbours and at peace in our own souls, we're fully alive. And it is sacred to me in the sense that it is the thing I'm trying to navigate by, right? The thing I'm trying to live by. And that doesn't mean I don't transgress it, but it is the one I want to always be coming back to.
Yeah. What I find fascinating is how different people, because you get some people who wouldn't call themselves Christian or even religious, probably. And then you get some people who very much do. And so their answers, because their understandings of that question are so varied. Is there anyone's answer that came so left field that you were like, whoa, that's insightful?
No, but I'm sort of learning that that's the point. That we're so formed to seek novelty.
Yeah.
That is not always good for us. And basically, what I realize is learning to tolerate the boredom of staying with the truth, even when it doesn't change, right? Basically, people say something around truth, something around goodness or love or relatedness.
Yeah.
And then a few others, sort of like solitude or space, about what the things they need in their lives. But the fact that the same ones come up again and again and again, I think is the point.
Yeah.
Right? That we have these things in common, and what we don't need is like 5 great new hacks for being a human. We don't know this one big idea that will make your life great.
Yeah.
Here is my one antidote for the pain of being a human being. No, what we need is to spend our time and attention on the things we already know to be true and give them enough time and attention to let them change us. And the restlessness of the human soul and the desire not to do actually what's very difficult but very simple, which is rest and live and seek to walk by our deep values, is really the repetition is part of the point, I think. James K. Smith has this line, no formation without repetition.
Yeah.
I'm like learning to stay, learning to sit, learning to repeat, learning to meditate, learning to not assume that the next podcast, Substack, book, meme has got the answer. Yeah. But that I actually already know how I flourish and what I need, and I need to stay with those things.
Yeah.
How do we move, I suppose, though, beyond the podcast, book, website article culture? Yeah. Because I think we have sort of imbibed an idea that if I just take in more information, suddenly how that will change me.
Yeah.
And I know loads of people who I think are listening to lots of podcasts talking about this, but the idea of actually stepping into a community, that's like a whole different ballgame. Because but I feel like that's where the rubber hits the road. That if you want to see change, it's only going to happen when you actually open yourself up in that way. And that's very different to just listening to Elizabeth on The Sacred or Re-Enchanting, isn't it? So I don't know, is there any kind of, I guess, what's the bridge to help people and what is actually, for a lot of people, a really unknown step into community, whether it be something like what you've developed or church or anything like that, I suppose?
Yeah, I think it will be different for everyone, but deciding to commit is a big part. Because when we go approaching these rhythms or these rituals or these communities that we have become convinced are what we need to form us, help us stay loyal to our values, very often it's like, I'll just dip my toe in the water, I'll give it a few weeks. Oh no, that person was really annoying. Off I go.
Yeah.
I think it's why marriage is so transformative, right?
Mm-hmm.
You lock yourself in so that when you hit this person's really annoying bit, you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying everyone should go and make vows to be part of a monastery or irrevocably sign themselves up to be part of a community. But assuming that things are going to take a long time and building that in at the beginning, saying, I'm going to join this community and I'm going to give it a year.
Mm-hmm.
And if at the end of the year, I'm still like, I don't think this is forming me in the direction that I want to be defining my life, this doesn't feel like it's helping me stay loyal to my values, then ask that question. But don't go for 2 or 3 weeks and then decide not, And for us, we spent one night a week for a year with these friends, talking and praying and thinking and reading and going to visit other communities. And then we rented together for 18 months. And then we're like, this living with each other is going to help us become more fully alive, become more the kind of people that we want to be, make it more likely that when we die, which happens to all of us, we will be able to look back and say, I did not spend my life distracted by nonsense. I spent it trying to grow in faith and hope and love. So we didn't just jump in madly into like really quite a significant financial commitment with another family, but we did decide. And I think that is a very countercultural thing, to be the person who is championing commitment and saying, what can we actually manage here? What can we promise each other? And say that we're not going to flake randomly. We're going to take this seriously. This is our life. This is our life. This is our time. What is the scaffolding that my future self needs when I'm tired and distracted and grumpy? How can I give her the best possible chance of making the decisions that are towards fully aliveness and not towards disconnection? And I'm all about set myself up for success.
And I love the phrase, I'm probably going to misquote it slightly, that you use in the book about that person you would want to be. I think it's something like the person you would want to be there at the end of the world.
Yeah.
Because what strikes me about that is you're not saying, I'm going to change the world and everything's going to be wonderful. Hey, the world might be going but am I going to be the kind of person
that's needed
at the end of the world? That's the phrase, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just speak into that just slightly, because I just found that a really helpful phrase right at the beginning of your book. Yeah.
So credit to Vanessa Zoltan for that, who has various different podcasts that are kind of secular forms of formation. Outside a religious tradition, how could you read a novel or go on pilgrimage in ways that are helping you become the kind of person that you want to be? And she's a good friend, and we have really, I have a huge amount of respect for her. And she used this phrase when she came on The Sacred, and it was like a key unlocking for me. I spend my temptation is to anxiety, right? Some people have temptations towards anger or excessive sadness or whatever. I push those two down with a lovely top layer of tension and fear. It's ever so healthy, given that the Bible is very comfortable with anger and grief and very clear that it's not big on fear. But when I do get overwhelmed about where the world is going on all these different axes, I have to surrender back to the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can. It's not. I don't think it's a position of passiveness.
No.
And the wisdom to know the difference. But given how much, because I am not God, I cannot change, the thing I can be at work on is my soul. And I always come back to this. Those who trust in the Lord are like trees planted by streams of living water. They will bear their fruit in season. They will not worry when the heat comes. And that, I think, what we need is steady people, peaceful people, not in a weird stoic, someone doesn't have emotions, which again, I do see some in some parts of the church. They're like, thinking, not feeling, don't trust your feelings. I'm like, Jesus has a lot of feelings. But someone who has a sort of deeply rooted peace.
Yep.
And has the openness and generosity to be loving their neighbours. And I think what fight or flight and anxiety can do is it makes it really difficult for us to love our neighbours. It really makes it really difficult for us to be a place of shelter for other people. And it makes us much more likely that we will blame everyone else around us and think we're the righteous ones. And I want deep roots into love so that I'm not that.
Well, I, for one, if and when the end of the world comes, want one of your spare bedrooms that you mentioned. Thank you. If I could shotgun one of those.
We should just buy a street. That's what I'm thinking now.
Yeah, an end of the world street where
yeah.
I am so reluctant to bring this conversation to an end I have just soaked up so much of it. You spoke about Vanessa having sort of keys to things. I feel like you've really provided us with many a key in this conversation. So thank you so much for joining us on Re-Enchanting.
Yeah,
Thank you for having
so
me.
much, Elizabeth. And if you're watching or listening and you'd like more from the show, you can, of course, get hold of us at seenandunseen.com, where you can also rate and review us. If you're listening by podcast, watching on YouTube, wherever you are, please do that. Helps others to discover the show. And you can also sign up to the newsletter.
Yeah, you can sign up to the newsletter and you can support us, seenandunseen.com/give. Everything's there.
But for now, from me and Belle and Elizabeth, thanks for watching and listening. See you next time.